The morning sun cast long shadows across the baked earth of the Amboseli Basin, where the skeletal remains of acacia trees stood like ancient sentinels against a bruised purple dawn. At 05:30, the air already carried the sharp, metallic scent of dust and profound desiccation. The prolonged seasonal drought had stripped the savanna of its usual vitality, leaving behind a fractured landscape of cracked mud and desperate survival where every calorie expended was a gamble against mortality. Inside the modified patrol vehicle, Marcus Thompson monitored the thermal imaging screen with the practiced stillness of a lead ethologist, accustomed to witnessing the harsh calculus of elephant survival. Beside him, Head Ranger Kiprotich Bet navigated the deeply rutted terrain with a fluid economy of motion, his eyes reading the microscopic disturbances in the sand that technology could never capture. They were tracking a specific acoustic signature and telemetry pattern belonging to the regional herd, but the data they were receiving was fundamentally wrong, contradicting centuries of documented behavioral evolution. Kiprotich brought the vehicle to a slow, deliberate halt, allowing the engine to idle with a low diesel thrum that seemed unnaturally loud in the vast empty basin. He pointed a calloused finger toward a series of massive depressions in the fine dust. The tracks belonged to Matriarch Saba, the massive battle-scared female, whose remarkable architecture of an elephant's brain contained the precise geographical memory of every subterranean water source within 100 miles. Under normal, severe drought conditions, she would be marching her family in a straight, relentless line toward the deep artesian wells of the southern boundary, maximizing their momentum while minimizing energy loss. Instead, the physical evidence on the ground revealed a chaotic overlapping pattern of hesitation and distress. The tracks showed they were circling, doubling back, and pacing erratically, tearing up the fragile crust of the earth. Marcus cross-referenced the GPS telemetry on his ruggedized tablet, noting the highly unnatural density of the grouping. Elephants, under extreme heat stress, instinctively spread out to maximize airflow and minimize the collective thermal load of their massive bodies. The screen, however, showed them tightly packed together, forming a solid, impenetrable mass of biological heat radiating brightly against the cool morning air. This behavior would soon challenge everything they thought they knew about the limitations of matriarchal threat response and interspecies communication. They drove forward at a creeping crawl, the heavy tires crushing brittle grass stems into fine powder. As they rounded a dense thicket of wait-a-bit thorn bushes, the landscape abruptly filled with moving gray mountains of flesh. The entire herd had stopped their migration. They did not flee from the sudden appearance of the vehicle, nor did they display the typical defensive posturing of flared ears, slashed trunks, and kicked dust. Instead, they initiated a maneuver that Marcus had only read about in obscure theoretical ethology journals detailing the extremes of pachyderm cognitive processing. Slowly, methodically, the massive forms began to shift their immense weight, creating a deliberate geometry in the wilderness. Moving without making a sound, stepping over dry riverbeds and broken branches, closing the perimeter tighter and tighter until the air itself felt heavy with their collective breath. The adult females moved into a tight circular formation, completely surrounding the patrol vehicle, cutting off any avenue of escape. The towering walls of wrinkled skin blocked out the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold as the rising sun filtered through the narrow gaps between their colossal bodies. The silence became deafening. There was no snapping of branches, no tearing of grass, no typical social murmurs or gentle tactile reassurances between sisters and aunts. The only sensation was a deep, infrasonic vibration, pitching low beneath the threshold of human hearing, a heavy rhythmic thumping that Marcus felt resonating directly within his ribcage. The collective cortisol of 20 adult elephants saturated the air with the sharp pheromonal scent of profound grief and primal terror. The circular wall of muscle and bone held the humans in an absolute perimeter of living flesh. Kiprotich kept both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his breathing shallow, his posture broadcasting absolute non-aggression to the giant mammals looming over the reinforced glass. Marcus slowly lowered his window, his clinical gaze sweeping the gray pillars until the formation slightly parted at the very front. From the dark center of the protective ring, Matriarch Saba emerged. Her temporal glands were weeping thick dark streaks of fluid down the sides of her face, a severe physiological marker of extreme psychological distress and systemic overload. And trapped in the deep shadow of her massive front legs, barely visible against the backdrop of the herd, was a tiny, fragile frame. It was a 3-month-old male calf. Marcus recognized the severe indicators of neonatal systemic collapse, immediately observing the precise metrics of a body giving up. The infant, whom the sanctuary logs would later officially record as Rafiki, was in the advanced stages of neurogenic shock. His temples were deeply sunken, indicating critical dehydration and a dangerous drop in blood volume. His small ears were pinned flat against his skull, and his entire body engaged in a stereotypic swaying motion, a desperate neurological attempt to self-soothe in the absolute absence of biological equilibrium and maternal regulation. He lacked the physical strength to even lift his trunk, allowing it to drag limply in the dirt, while his breathing manifested as a wet, fractured wheezing that tore through the heavy, oppressive silence of the basin. In the wild, a calf this severely compromised would typically be abandoned to the predators, a tragic but necessary mathematical equation designed to ensure the survival of the healthy breeding females who carried the genetic future of the herd. But the herd had not abandoned the injured infant. They had carried him, supported his failing weight with their trunks, and ultimately trapped the human rangers in a circle of desperate surrender. Saba stepped closer, her massive frame casting a heavy, suffocating shadow over the windshield. The invisible bridge between apex wilderness and human intervention vanished in that single moment. She extended her trunk, the deeply scarred prehensile tip hovering mere inches from the open window, tasting the dry air, absorbing the unique chemical signatures of the men sitting frozen inside the cabin. Then, fighting every instinct embedded in her ancient DNA, protecting her family from apex predators, she curled her trunk backward and wrapped it gently around the shivering, collapsing form of the calf. With a slow, agonizing push, she nudged the crying elephant forward, thrusting him directly toward the metallic shell of the vehicle. The tiny creature stumbled, his spindly legs buckling under the sudden exposure to the open space, away from the protective bulk of his aunts. He let out a raw, panicky vocalization, the universal language of loss and loneliness that transcended species boundaries, echoing off the dry earth. Saba did not reach out to pull him back into the safety of the herd. She stood completely still, a living monument of quiet mourning, forcing the humans to accept the burden of a fragile life the unforgiving savannah could no longer sustain. Marcus unlatched the heavy side door, the sharp, metallic click sounding like a gunshot in the profound stillness. He moved with slow, deliberate precision, his analytical mind already rapidly calculating intravenous fluid volumes, blood glucose levels, and necessary electrolyte replacement ratios for a severely dehydrated neonate. Kiprotich stepped out the opposite side, moving silently to support the collapsing weight of the 70-kilogram infant before he could strike the hard ground. As the men laid their bare hands on the coarse, dust-covered skin of the calf, the entire herd took a single synchronized step backward. The heavy infrasonic rumbling that had rattled the windows abruptly ceased. The tight circular formation slowly dissolved as the adult females turned their heavy heads toward the shimmering horizon, their silent, agonizing duty fulfilled. Marcus knelt in the dust, feeling the rapid, erratic, thready pulse beneath the thin skin behind the calf's ear, mapping the immediate medical emergency that lay ahead of them. He noted that this wasn't just a physical failure of hydration and nutrition that could be fixed with a simple saline drip. The profound maternal separation trauma had completely rewired the calf's nervous system, plunging him into a dangerous state of cognitive shutdown. As the great herd faded like massive gray ghosts into the morning heat haze, leaving only the scent of disturbed dust and weeping temporal glands behind in the quiet basin, Marcus wrapped his arms securely around the trembling infant, knowing with absolute certainty that stabilizing his collapsing vital signs would be the easiest part of the long journey ahead. The true battle would be fighting the invisible architecture of his grief. Kiprotich Bet moved with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent his entire life reading the subtle language of the Amboseli Basin, returning from the idling patrol vehicle, carrying the heavy trauma kit, his boots kicking up small clouds of rust-colored dust that settled over the motionless form of baby Rafiki. Marcus laid the 3-month-old calf gently onto his side against the baked earth, noting how the small ribcage barely rose and fell in the oppressive heat. The ethologist's hands moved rapidly over the coarse, sparse hair of the infant, mapping a terrifying topography of systemic failure. The mucous membranes inside the small mouth were pale and tacky, indicating a level of cellular dehydration that bordered on irreversible organ damage. This was the harsh reality of the drought, where the relentless sun stripped life from the weak with mathematical precision. Marcus reached into the kit and extracted a heavy-gauge intravenous catheter, knowing that establishing vascular access in a creature experiencing profound neurogenic shock was a delicate race against time. He focused on the vast network of vessels mapping the back of the calf's large ear, a biological radiator now cold and clammy to the touch. The blood pressure had plummeted so dangerously low that the veins were flat and invisible beneath the thick gray skin, requiring Marcus to rely entirely on tactile memory and anatomical intuition. He pressed his thumb against the base of the ear to create a tourniquet effect, waiting for any slight distension, while the early light illuminated the dry scrubland, revealing the desperate fragility of the moment. He inserted the needle smoothly, feeling the distinct pop as it breached the vein, but there was no immediate flash of blood in the hub. The profound dehydration had turned the calf's blood thick and sluggish, a dark syrup, struggling to maintain the rapidly failing core functions of his tiny body. Marcus adjusted the angle, microscopically holding his breath, until a slow, dark bead finally appeared confirming entry. Kiprotich handed him the line, and Marcus connected it, securing the hub with thick strips of surgical tape before elevating the 1-liter bag of gravity-fed saline mixed with essential electrolytes. They watched the drip chamber begin its rhythmic clicking, a steady artificial heartbeat in the vast silence of the wilderness. The fluid rushed into the collapsed vascular system, but baby Rafiki offered no resistance, no primal terror, no struggle against the humans handling him. Under the brutal mathematics of the wild, a calf separated from its mother should vocalize thrash or attempt to flee. But this infant lay perfectly still, his small trunk curled inward in a posture of complete psychological surrender. He was drowning in an internal flood of cortisol, shutting down his own cognitive processes to shield his fragile mind from the overwhelming trauma of sudden abandonment. Lifting the massive form of the baby elephant into the back of the modified patrol vehicle required both men to brace themselves against the sheer dead weight of an animal that had stopped fighting for its own existence. Kiprotich positioned the calf carefully on a bed of heavy canvas tarps, while Marcus knelt beside the fragile frame, elevating the IV bag against the metal roll bar of the truck bed. As the engine roared to life, shattering the sacred quiet of the basin, Kiprotich shifted into gear and began the arduous navigation over the rutted terrain toward the sanctuary. The vehicle lurched and swayed violently over dried riverbeds and exposed acacia roots. But Marcus absorbed the impacts with his own body serving as a living shield to keep the needle secure in the paper-thin ear. He watched the micro-movements of the calf, observing a slight involuntary twitch of the temporal gland and the shallow, irregular expansion of the ribs as the saline slowly rehydrated the exhausted tissues. The ethologist found his mind drifting back to the staggering anomaly of the morning encounter, to the way matriarch Saba had utilized the bodies of her own herd to create an impenetrable defensive boundary, only to relinquish this precious life to a species traditionally viewed as apex predators. It was a cognitive leap that defied every established paradigm regarding elephant threat assessment and the capacity for interspecies trust. Miles away within the specialized critical care unit of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Sanctuary, Elena Vance moved through the isolation paddock with methodical, unhurried precision. She was a veterinary nurse whose entire career was defined by patient observation and tactile therapeutic intervention for orphaned mammals. Elena knew that long-term healing required not just physical survival but psychological well-being, and the environment she was preparing reflected a deep understanding of sensory de-escalation protocols. She had already received the crackling radio transmission detailing the critical state of the incoming patient, and she understood that the sterile smell of clinical disinfectants could trigger a secondary panic response in a wild animal already suffering from acute trauma. Instead, she scattered fresh red earth over the concrete floor, moistening it with warm water to mimic the rich organic scent of the natural mud wallows that dotted the Amboseli landscape during the rainy season. She adjusted the ambient thermal lamps hanging from the high ceiling to cast a soft coppery light, establishing a localized climate zone designed to help the shivering infant thermoregulate without the massive insulating presence of a mother's body. The silence in the room was intentional and heavy. In the adjacent prep room, Elena prepared the nutritional baseline formulated by Marcus required to restart the calf's digestive system. She measured precise scoops of the synthetic colostrum formula, a specialized veterinary nutrient mix high in lipids and immunoglobulins essential for compromised calves whose immune systems were entirely dependent on maternal antibodies. She whisked the thick, creamy liquid into hot, sterilized water, constantly checking the digital thermometer to ensure the mixture reached exact internal body temperature. If the formula was even a fraction of a degree too cold, the calf's severely depressed metabolic system would expend dangerous amounts of energy trying to warm it, leading to a potentially fatal drop in core temperature. Elena worked in profound silence, allowing the quiet hum of the clinic's backup generator to act as a steady acoustic baseline against the impending chaos of a medical emergency. She was preparing the battlefield for a war against the profound maternal separation trauma, knowing that when the physical deficits were finally corrected, the true, terrifying emptiness would remain. The sanctuary possessed all the modern medical technology required to sustain a biological organism, but Elena understood deeply that they could not easily replace the infrasonic rumbles, the gentle strokes of a massive trunk, or the complex matriarchal architecture that defined an elephant's cognitive world. The sound of heavy tires grinding against the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of the patrol vehicle, breaking Elena's concentration. She stepped out of the isolation paddock and moved swiftly toward the loading bay, the harsh, mid-morning equatorial light momentarily blinding her after the dim-controlled sanctuary interior. Kiprotich reversed the truck precisely to the edge of the concrete ramp, cutting the engine so a heavy, unnatural quiet instantly flooded the loading bay. Marcus was already unhooking the nearly empty IV bag from the roll bar, his face coated in a fine layer of pale dust, his expression locked in a state of clinical focus that barely concealed his underlying exhaustion. Elena climbed into the back of the truck without speaking and knelt beside baby Rafiki, immediately placing her palm against the soft depression just above the calf's eye to assess his core temperature and hydration status. She noted the sunken temples, the flaccid muscle tone, and the terrifyingly slow respiration rate that barely moved the canvas tarp beneath him. Her fingers traced the line of the intravenous catheter, noting the sluggish flow of the saline, before her gaze dropped to the curled, motionless trunk. The infant was entirely disconnected from his physical surroundings, trapped in a dark psychological void, where human intervention meant absolutely nothing. They moved him with agonizing, deliberate care, sliding the heavy canvas tarp down the metal ramp and into the prepared, climate-controlled paddock. As they transferred his weight onto the bed of soft teff grass and warm therapeutic mats, the calf remained entirely limp, a physical manifestation of absolute despair that weighed far more than his 60 kilograms. Marcus secured a new bag of warmed lactated Ringer's solution to the overhead clinical rail, while Elena quickly drew a vial of blood from a secondary ear vein to run a complete metabolic panel. The blood drawn into the syringe was terrifyingly dark, a visual confirmation of the severe dehydration and the immense toxic strain on the kidneys. Kiprotich stood quietly by the heavy wooden door of the enclosure, watching the intricate dance of veterinary intervention, his presence a silent anchor bridging the wild, unforgiving space they had just left and the sterile hope of the clinic. The three of them operated in a synchronized silence defined by years of shared emergencies and unspoken protocols, moving around the massive form of the baby elephant with a practiced reverence. They understood that the upcoming hours would dictate whether the biological machinery of the calf could be restarted. But Marcus, watching Elena gently stroke the coarse hair along the spine, knew the much deeper truth. The physical stabilization was merely the foundation, a bare prerequisite for the agonizingly slow process of psychological healing that would require bridging the vast evolutionary gap between their species. He knew that in the end what matters most isn't what we remember but what we feel, and right now baby Rafiki felt nothing but the crushing, inescapable gravity of his own isolation. By the 8th day in the isolation paddock, the situation had deteriorated into a critical physiological stalemate. Marcus Thompson stood behind the one-way observation glass, watching the telemetry data stream across the monitor with a growing sense of clinical dread. The numbers painted a grim portrait of a body consuming itself from the inside out. Baby Rafiki's resting heart rate remained dangerously elevated, and the blood panels Elena Vance had drawn earlier that morning indicated a cortisol cascade that was effectively shutting down his digestive tract. He was refusing the synthetic colostrum formula, completely turning his massive head away from the feeding apparatus and retreating to the furthest corner of the enclosure. His behavior had devolved into the stereotypic manifestations of profound grief. He stood motionless against the concrete reinforcement wall, his forehead pressed hard against the unyielding surface, while his trunk swung in a monotonous, pendulous rhythm that served as a visual metronome for his despair. This wasn't just a medical problem. This was a problem of the soul, and the rigid protocols of veterinary science offered no standardized dosage for a shattered heart. The isolation paddock, designed to minimize acoustic stress and regulate ambient temperature, had become an echo chamber for his silent mourning. Every attempt Elena made to initiate contact was met with a defensive posturing that spoke volumes about his primal terror. His tiny frame, shivering despite the ambient warmth of the room, seemed to shrink inward, as if he were trying to compress his physical existence into an infinitely small point to escape the agony of consciousness. Kiprotich-Bet joined Marcus in the observation room, the head ranger's face drawn tight with the weight of responsibility. He noted quietly that out in the Amboseli wilderness, matriarch Saba would already be leading the herd toward the southern waterholes, moving with the grim efficiency required to save the many at the expense of the one. In the unforgiving logic of the savannah, the calf had become a liability, but here within the sterile confines of the sanctuary, they were attempting to reverse a decision made by centuries of evolutionary instinct. Kiprotich pointed out the subtle shifting of the calf's hind legs, explaining that the animal was experiencing phantom herd sensations, his nervous system still expecting the constant, reassuring pressure of his aunts and siblings crowding against him in the dark. Without that physical boundary, the vast emptiness of the room was causing sensory vertigo, a profound spatial disorientation that only deepened his neurogenic shock. Kiprotich understood the language of the wild better than any textbook, and he observed that for an elephant calf to exist outside the physical boundary of the herd was akin to floating untethered in a void where there was no context for existence. The turning point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon during the second week when it became mathematically undeniable that they had less than 48 hours before the metabolic damage became irreversible. Elena Vance walked into the preparation room and bypassed the sterile medical equipment, reaching instead for an intervention that relied entirely on tactile memory. She gathered the somatic regulation blanket, a heavy, coarse wool textile that had been deliberately weathered and infused with the deep, earthy scents of dried mud acacia bark and the territorial dung of adult elephants. It smelled of the Amboseli Basin wilderness of matriarchal authority, of the very world that had so violently ejected the calf. Marcus documented in his clinical log that Elena was attempting a high-risk sensory override, aiming to bypass the cognitive trauma centers and communicate directly with the calf's parasympathetic nervous system. She entered the paddock with agonizing slowness, carrying the heavy fabric. Baby Rafiki recoiled, his ears flaring in a weak but desperate mock charge, but Elena did not retreat, and she did not advance. She simply sank to her knees and waited, allowing the complex olfactory data embedded in the wool to drift across the climate-controlled space. For 90 excruciating minutes, she remained a motionless fixture in his environment. Then, moving with the deliberate fluidity of a predator attempting to appear as harmless as falling leaves, she began to wrap the somatic regulation blanket around the calf's trembling shoulders, pulling it tight against his ribs to simulate the immense physical boundaries of a mother's body. The weight of the fabric provided a deep tissue pressure that triggered an immediate autonomic response. Marcus watched the monitors as baby Rafiki's respiratory rate hitched and then suddenly dropped, transitioning from the shallow, rapid pants of panic to a deeper rhythmic draw. The blanket became a living shield, an architectural boundary against the terrifying expansiveness of his new world, tricking his brain chemistry into releasing the first microscopic amounts of oxytocin to counteract the flooding cortisol. With his neurogenic shock momentarily buffered by the somatic grounding, the calf finally allowed Elena to position the feeding tube. He consumed 3 liters of the synthetic colostrum formula, not with the greedy enthusiasm of a healthy baby, but with the mechanical resignation of a creature whose biology was overriding its desire to simply fade away. The lipid-heavy liquid coated his stomach, providing the essential immunoglobulins, amino acids, and complex carbohydrates his system desperately required to fight off opportunistic infections and stabilize his plunging blood glucose levels. The physical stabilization was only the barest beginning a temporary ceasefire in the war for his survival. The psychological recovery stretched into weeks of delicate, invisible care, where every interaction was a negotiation of boundaries. They established a routine dictated entirely by the calf's microsignals, where the slightest tension in the muscles of his jaw, the flaring of a nostril, or the subtle shifting of his weight backward, meant Elena would instantly cease her movements and withdraw. They were building an invisible bridge between species, constructed out of mutual respect for his trauma and an unwavering commitment to his autonomy. It was a period marked by long, silent hours, sitting in the dim amber light of the enclosure, where the stillness weighed heavily in the air, and the only sound was the heavy rustle of the somatic regulation blanket as baby Rafiki shifted his weight. Marcus documented every minute change, observing the way the calf's temporal glands gradually stopped weeping the stress-induced secretions, the slow return of normal digestive rumbles, and the way his trunk stopped its frantic searching of the concrete floor and began to gently map the contours of his enclosure. Kiprotich would often stand at the perimeter fence at night listening to the wind and noting the absence of the calf's earlier high-pitched distress vocalizations. He knew that out in the darkness the wild herds were moving like silent gray ghosts across the plains, completely unaware of the immense human effort being poured into a single discarded life. Yet despite these clinical improvements, the emotional barrier remained a towering monolith of fear. The calf accepted their presence as a survival necessity, but he offered nothing in return, keeping his internal world tightly locked away behind walls of profound grief. The breakthrough came on the dawn of the third month, entirely upending their clinical projections regarding the timeline of emotional recovery. The early light pierced the rust-colored earth outside the sanctuary, filtering a pale, coppery glow through the high windows of the isolation paddock. Elena was sitting motionless on the floor, her back against the reinforced wall, her breathing perfectly synchronized with the slow rise and fall of the calf's massive chest. Baby Rafiki had spent the last hours standing quietly near the center of the room, wrapped tightly in the comforting weight of the somatic regulation blanket, his eyes half closed in a state of restful awareness. Then, without any external prompting, he took a step forward. He did not rush, and he did not display the frantic uncertainty that had characterized his early days in the facility. His movements were deliberate and deeply considered, as if the complex neural network of his trauma was finally allowing a microscopic crack in the armor of his grief. Elena kept her hands resting loosely on her knees, suppressing every human instinct to reach out and welcome him, understanding that this moment belonged entirely to him, and that any sudden movement could shatter the fragile trust that had taken months to cultivate. The tip of his trunk, a highly sensitive organ packed with tens of thousands of nerve endings capable of cracking a peanut or uprooting a tree, extended toward her. It hovered mere inches from her face, feeling the warmth of her breath, analyzing the chemical signature of her skin, and processing the quiet, steady rhythm of her heart. Then, with a gentleness that transcended species boundaries, he rested the moist tip of his trunk against the open palm of her hand. He exhaled a long, slow breath that vibrated with a low infrasonic frequency. A deep, continuous rumble felt more in Elena's chest than heard by her ears. It was a profound declaration of trust, a biological and emotional surrender that signaled the end of his profound isolation. Marcus, watching from the observation deck, felt a sudden tightening in his throat, noting in his log that the heart rate monitor showed a perfect, steady rhythm, proving a return to not just physical survival but psychological well-being. This wasn't merely a successful veterinary intervention, it was a testament to the resilience of a traumatized innocent choosing to engage with a world that had previously offered nothing but pain. The profound evolutionary gap had been crossed, and in the quiet sanctuary of the paddock surrounded by the scent of wild earth and the steady hum of medical equipment, two vastly different species shared a moment of profound recognitions, speaking the universal language of loss and loneliness, and the quiet courage required to simply keep living. The days following that dawn of the third month established a delicate but foundational new rhythm within the climate-controlled confines of the isolation paddock. Having finally initiated voluntary tactile contact, the calf began to process the presence of his human caregivers not as predatory threats, but as structural pillars in his shattered world. Elena, maintaining her characteristic methodical patience, utilized this breakthrough to optimize his nutritional intake. When she wrapped the heavy somatic regulation blanket around his fragile shoulders, the physical pressure no longer triggered the frantic stereotypic swaying of his earlier psychological damage, but instead elicited a deep, stabilizing sigh that vibrated through the floorboards. His cortisol levels, tracked meticulously through daily dung sample evaluations, began a steady downward trajectory, while his previously erratic heart rate synchronized into a calm baseline. It was only within this neurochemically stabilized state that his digestive tract fully accepted the synthetic colostrum formula, processing the high-lipid veterinary nutrient mix efficiently enough to add nearly 2 kilograms of body mass per week. Marcus, observing from the monitoring deck, noted that the calf's recovery was a textbook demonstration of how somatic anchoring could bypass the cognitive loops of panic, allowing the parasympathetic nervous system to finally override weeks of sustained neurogenic shock. But the cognitive landscape of an elephant is vast, and deeply associative and psychological injury in such highly evolved mammalian brains rarely dissipates in a linear progression. The breakthrough was severely tested during the 16th week of his rehabilitation, when the punishing drought that had strangled the Amboseli Basin finally broke. The incoming weather front was preceded by a massive drop in barometric pressure that registered on the sanctuary's meteorological equipment hours, before the first clouds appeared, gathering like dark bruises over the eastern horizon. To the human staff, it was a welcome relief from the stifling heat, but to baby Rafiki, the shifting atmospheric density was a harbinger of absolute terror. As the first deafening crack of thunder tore across the African sky, the acoustic violence perfectly mirrored the auditory chaos of the day he was separated from his family. The sudden barrage of high-decibel atmospheric static triggered an immediate and devastating PTSD relapse. By the time Elena Vance reached the isolation paddock, the young elephant had retreated to the furthest corner facing the concrete wall in a rigid catatonic state. He completely rejected the synthetic colostrum formula, striking out blindly with his trunk when the feeding tube was offered and refusing even the comforting weight of the somatic regulation blanket, which now lay trampled and soiled in the corner. His eyes rolled back, revealing the whites in a classic display of prey animal terror. Blood tests drawn under extreme duress indicated a catastrophic spike in cortisol and a plummeting blood glucose level. Marcus knew with grim clinical certainty that if the animal did not resume caloric intake within 48 hours, his metabolism would cannibalize its own fat stores, precipitating acute hepatic lipidosis and eventual multi-organ failure. An absolute suffocating quiet filled the observation room as they watched the monitors display his erratic tachycardia. Traditional veterinary de-escalation protocols were proving entirely useless against the sheer magnitude of the regression. The auditory hallucinations of the storm had overwhelmed his fragile sense of safety. It was Kiprotich Bet, drawing upon decades of indigenous tracking knowledge and an intimate understanding of herd communication, who proposed a radical acoustic intervention. Recognizing that airborne sounds were currently triggering the panic the head ranger suggested, bypassing the auditory canal entirely. He retrieved a series of heavy seismic subwoofers from the sanctuary's acoustic research lab and positioned them firmly against the exterior concrete foundation of the isolation paddock. Instead of playing soothing ambient noises, Kiprotich queued up archived low-frequency field recordings of matriarch Saba's wild herd, utilizing an infrasonic spectrum pitched far below the threshold of human hearing. When he initiated the playback, the room remained deceptively silent to the human observers, but the concrete floor began to pulse with a slow, rhythmic, mechanical vibration. The physics of the intervention relied on the unique structural density of an elephant's skeletal anatomy. The low-frequency rumbles traveled seismically through the ground and were absorbed by the densely packed Pacinian corpuscles located in the fatty digital cushions of baby Rafiki's feet, transmitting the data directly up his leg bones to his middle ear. The effect was almost instantaneous and deeply moving to witness. The rigid catatonia that had locked his muscles in a state of hypervigilant paralysis began to fracture. Slowly, as if waking from a deep pharmacological sedation, the calf stopped his frantic swaying. He lowered his massive head and pressed the sensitive tip of his trunk flat against the vibrating floorboards, closing his eyes to fully process the complex acoustic signature of his ancestral lineage. The deep seismic rumbles, mimicking the territorial reassurance of a matriarchal structure, acted as a master key, unlocking his frozen nervous system, bypassing the traumatized amygdala entirely and speaking directly to his cellular memory. His breathing slowed from rapid, terrified gasps to deep, measured exhalations, inflating his lungs with deliberate purpose. Within an hour of the infrasonic application, the psychological freeze melted away entirely, and he turned back toward Elena, his trunk reaching out to gently trace the outline of her knee before accepting the synthetic colostrum formula in long, desperate swallows. The success of that acoustic intervention marked the final turning point in his clinical trajectory, solidifying a resilience that would carry him through the remainder of his time at the facility. As weeks turned into months, the tiny, emaciated orphan transformed into a robust and imposing juvenile. By the time the calendar reached the 18th month, the young bull weighed well over 800 kilograms, his shoulders broad, and his trunk movements possessing the precise, deliberate articulation of a healthy subadult. The time had come for the most dangerous and necessary phase of his rehabilitation, at exactly 06. 2 a.m. on the scheduled day of release, the morning sun cast long shadows across the rust-colored earth of the Amboseli Basin, painting the vast savanna in brilliant shades of amber and copper. Inside the staging enclosure, Kiprotich approached the young elephant to perform one final crucial protocol. Moving with practiced calm, the head ranger fitted a specially designed clay collar tag around his thick neck. This device was a marvel of conservation engineering, a non-invasive biodegradable identification tag crafted from compressed local mud and acacia fibers housing a microscopic telemetry unit. It was meticulously scent masked with natural dung and soil to ensure that he would carry absolutely no olfactory trace of human habitation back into the wild. The tag was programmed to provide vital physiological markers to the sanctuary's monitoring network for exactly 1 year before naturally dissolving back into the earth, leaving the animal entirely untethered from his clinical past. The journey to the transitional boundary of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Sanctuary was conducted in absolute silence, their boots crunching softly against the parched earth. Marcus, Elena, and Kiprotich walked alongside the massive form, guiding him toward the open expanse of the wilderness. The protocol now demanded a complete and irreversible cessation of human contact. There would be no final affectionate touches, no lingering strokes of the trunk, and no soft words of farewell. By the ruthless metrics of natural selection, any lingering habituation to humans was a death sentence. As they reached the edge of the protected zone, where the fenced perimeter gave way to the endless rolling grasslands of the Amboseli Basin, the human caretakers stopped and took a synchronized step backward, deliberately removing themselves from his immediate sensory sphere. Baby Rafiki stood alone at the threshold of two worlds. He paused for a long, tense moment, the morning breeze rippling the coarse hairs along his spine. Then a subtle shift occurred in the distance. The dust on the horizon began to swirl, in part revealing the magnificent scarred silhouettes of a wild herd moving deliberately through the acacia, scrubbed their massive gray forms, emerging like ancient monoliths from the shimmering heat. It was matriarch Saba leading her family along their ancient migratory corridor, precisely where Kiprotich's tracking data had predicted they would be. The massive female paused her temporal glands, weeping slightly in the morning heat as she turned her head toward the sanctuary boundary. The young bull lifted his head high, his ears flaring outward to their maximum extension. He did not look back at the humans, who had painstakingly rebuilt his shattered body and spirit. Instead, he tested the dry wind and emitted a deep, earth-shaking infrasonic rumble, a declaration of existence that vibrated through the soles of Marcus's boots. Across the expanse of the savanna, matriarch Saba answered. The matriarch's response was not merely a vocalization, but a physical wave of acoustic acceptance that seemed to command the very landscape to stillness. The wild adult elephants moved with deliberate synchronized grace, shifting their massive frames until they stood in the exact same impenetrable circular formation that had surrounded the patrol vehicle 18 months prior. But this time the living shield was not opening to force a dying calf into human hands. It was opening to welcome a survivor back into the fold. The young bull stepped forward, crossing the invisible boundary line, leaving behind the scent of antiseptics and the hum of the sanctuary. His gait was steady and confident, carrying the weight of his survival with an instinctual grace that transcended the sterile confines of his medical isolation. He walked directly toward the towering matriarchal shield, dissolving seamlessly into the genetic and social memory of the family. Marcus, watching the massive form disappear into the dust, and the heat haze, felt the heavy weight of the moment settle in his chest. He reached up to adjust his glasses, noting the telemetry ping from the clay collar tag, registering on his handheld device a perfect steady rhythm of a wild heart beating in its rightful place. The legacy of their unlikely connection was not meant to be kept or preserved in a paddock, but to be surrendered utterly to the vastness of the natural world. It was a living reminder that sometimes the most profound healing is found not in the holding on, but in the agonizing, beautiful courage required to simply let go.